Racing through time is the story of the drivers, the cars, the teams, and the famous circuits that made motorsport history. Cooper's contribution to motorsport is long and important. World champions, Grand Prix and Indianapolis revolutionaries, production racing pioneers, and a 40-year history with one of the world's most popular cars, the Mini Cooper. Charles Cooper had always been interested in motor racing, but as the owner of a small garage in Surbiton, south of London, he never had the financial resources to actually go racing. After World War II, Charles and his son John decided to go racing in the new 500cc class, which used affordable motorcycle components to create economical racing. Cooper's first racing car was based on two Fiat 500 Topolinos welded together, with the engine placed behind the driver. This is the very first Cooper built for the 500cc class. At the wheel of the JAP-powered car is John Cooper, Prescott Hill Climb in 1946. One of Cooper's first customers was Eric Brandon, but perhaps his most important was a young Stirling Moss.
When I started, remember, there were no races. We were all hill climbs because we didn't have races, and so I entered in places like Chelsea Walsh and Stanmer Park and Booley Bay and so on.
Motor racing had become a pastime which was interesting more people than ever. In the immediate post-war years, a cheap form of racing, if motor racing is ever cheap, was 500cc racing. Young drivers like Peter Collins, here in number 11, and Stirling Moss learnt their craft in these motorcycle-engined races. What had started as a British national formula soon became an international formula, with 500cc races taking place all over Europe. The Cooper Car Company was just one of a number of companies producing 500cc cars, but they had been the first, and they were certainly the most successful. Their small production line attracted many customers, some of whom fitted the cars with the twin-cylinder 1100cc engines built for hill climbs and Formula 2 races. John Bolster looks at the Cooper factory in the early days. It wasn't just ex-servicemen and young men trying to get a start in motor racing. There were a number of established drivers, among them Harry Schell, a member of the wealthy O'Reilly Schell family, and the French driver Raymond Sommer. The races were always closely fought and exciting. It was the start of Cooper as a racing car manufacturer.
Basically, the 500 was the logical step because it was really a four-wheeled motorcycle. And there was a formula for that car for people to start motor racing. And the logical step was to go put the bigger engine in, the 1100 engine in, which gave it a lot more performance and made it a very successful hill climb car. And we had at that time built a few front engine cars using the same suspension, the wishbone and the leaf spring, and we built some MG specials and Vauxhall engine cars and that sort of thing. And the Bristol engine was a logical thing to use because it was not it was and really it was such a big engine, a long engine, the Bristol. The only place to put it was in the front of the car, and so we just built a front engine motor car, really, and that's when Mike Hawthorne came along and made it so successful, thanks to him.
It was Mike Hawthorne's driving of the front-engined Formula 2 Cooper Bristol that made Cooper's name internationally. The World Championship in 1952 and 53 was for 2-litre cars, opening up possibilities for smaller manufacturers and teams to compete. Hawthorne had taken the car on a number of continental trips, finishing well up at Spa and taking third in the British Grand Prix. He proved that the Cooper could cope with the French Gordinis, if not Ferrari and Maserati. At this time, Moss and Hawthorne achieved racing success for Cooper, but it was another British driver, Roy Salvadori, who taught Charles and John Cooper the motor racing business.
I'd known Roy since my first days of motor racing after the war. I met him at Granson Lodge Hill Climb or Sprint. That was just after the war, when we started racing, and he was in the motor business, and we were in the motor business, so we knew each other. And he was a great friend of my father's as well, Roy. And he started racing I think it was when he started racing, it was the sports cars, the rear-engine sports cars, and of course later on onto the single-seater cars. And although we were a very sort of small band in our little garage building cars, and Roy showed us the business way of motor racing, really, the way to deal with organisers and turn it into a proper business.
The Mark I Cooper Jaguar and the Mark II sports cars followed on from earlier cars fitted with Vauxhall and Ford engines. These took part in the 9-hour race at Goodwood and in sports car races on the continent. The most successful was the little 1100cc Coventry Climax engined car. It was this car and their association with Coventry Climax engines that moved Cooper from small-time operators into major racing car manufacturers, with drivers like Roy Salvadori and Jack Brabham.
When we first met Wally Haston of Climaxes, Coventry Climaxes, they were building this light aluminium fire pump engine, which was so suitable to go in the rear of a car that started it all off, really, putting the engine in the back.
So the rear-engined revolution that had started in 500s had moved on to sports cars. When Jack Brabham first came to Britain, it was to drive cars like the classic front-engined 250F Maserati. However, a few short years later, the whole concept of Grand Prix and Indianapolis cars had changed. Here are the front-engined cars like the Cooper Alta of Stirling Moss and the Cooper Bristols of Ken Wharton and Bob Gerrard. Peter Collins and the Van Wall had shown that British cars with British engineering were capable of competing with Grand Prix cars from Italy. This was confirmed when Stirling Moss joined the team and Van Wall won World Championship races in 1957. Cooper's rear-engine Grand Prix cars really started way back in 1955 with Jack Brabham and a Bristol engine in the back of his self-built car at Aintree.
Well, the Cooper car side of it started in Australia, really, because I was racing a Cooper Bristol out in Australia for a couple of years before I came over. And of course, having raced a Cooper Bristol out there, when I got to England, one of the first places I went to was the Cooper Car Company in Surbiton, and met John Cooper and Charles Cooper there, and strangely enough they'd heard about me driving this Cooper Bristol out in Australia, and I got on very well with them, and the following year I started actually driving in the team.
When we started building these rear-engine sports cars, which were driven by Stirling Moss and Jack Brabham in those days, and Ivor Boer, and it was the original one was a light aluminium fire pump engine, and which started off as an 1100 and then finished up as a 1500, and then we persuaded them to build bigger engines. And Jack decided that he'd already raced a Cooper Bristol with a front engine and I think he'd won the Australian Grand Prix, and it was called the Red X Special, the front engine Cooper Bristol. And he decided to put a Bristol engine in the back of one of the, virtually one of our sports cars, really.
Actually, the British Grand Prix really was a car that John Cooper and Charles Cooper let me build in the workshop myself. And the car at the time was a little central seat sports car with a Coventry Climax engine, and I decided to put a Bristol engine in the back of a similar sort of car, and I actually made the car at Cooper's myself and raced it for the first time at the British Grand Prix. And although the car went very well, unfortunately the clutch packed up on it before the end. But then I went out to Australia, of course, and won the Australian Grand Prix with that car, so it was worthwhile. In Australia, I did drive a rear-engine Mark IV Cooper with a motorcycle engine in the back, but then just before, the 2 years before coming over, I was driving a Cooper Bristol, which was a front-engine car. And I always felt that the rear-engine car had advantages, and because when I got tied up with Coopers and saw what they were doing, I was all for it, and decided to put the Cooper Bristol engine in the back of the car, which turned out to be really the start of the first Grand Prix car of Cooper's, really. Yes, I think initially it helped me greatly, particularly with Cooper's and getting the opportunity to drive in the team. Being able to drive a car is one thing, but if you can help develop the motor car, as you say, there wasn't too many people around in those days that did that, and I think that helped me quite a lot.
Well, it started off, as I said, we started off, we had the rear engine sports car with the fire pump engine first, which gradually started at 1100 and went up to 1500. Then we built single-seater versions of that for Formula 2 with this light 1500 fire pump type engine. And then, of course, after we'd managed to sort Mr. Lee of Coventry Climax out, buying him a few more gins and tonics, he managed to persuade, and he got Wally Hassan to build a twin-engine version, a proper twin-engine 1500, which later became 1750, 2.2, and eventually a 2.5 litre.
The rear-engined Formula 2 Cooper originally had the 1500cc single overhead cam unit. The car proved successful, particularly in the hands of Salvadori in 1956. Were they easy cars to drive?
I can't think that it didn't seem any different to a front-engine car, not that particular car. It was when they developed more power that they were different, but in the early days, when they had limited amount of power, they'd handled very much like a front-engine car.
Cooper's World Championship involvement came about almost by accident. By 1957, Cooper were thinking of enlarging the engine so it could compete with Formula 1 cars. Leonard Lee of Coventry Climax was persuaded to build the larger engine, and the car was sent out to Monaco. The Coventry Climax in the Cooper had a capacity of 2 litres compared to the 2.5 litre limit. Jack Brabham was down to drive the car, but he damaged it in practice, necessitating a complete rebuild. When it came to the race, this was almost a rags to riches story. And who were Cooper taking on? Stirling Moss and Tony Brooks driving Van Walls, Peter Collins and Mike Hawthorne driving for Ferrari, and Juan Manuel Fangio and Jean Beira driving for Maserati. The top 6 drivers in the world in the top 6 cars. There was an incident shortly after the start. Moss had a brake problem with the leading Van Wall, and the accident took out the cars of both Hawthorne and Peter Collins. The 3 British stars effectively were out of the race in one hit. As Moss, Collins and Hawthorne walked back to the pits, the lead was taken over by Fangio, and behind him at a comfortable distance, Tony Brooks. The performance of Brabham in the Cooper amazed everyone, and he was soon up to third place. It looked as if he would stay there for the rest of the race to claim Cooper's first ever podium. Disappointingly, in the final laps, there was a fuel pump problem with the little car from Surbiton. The hopes of John Cooper appeared to be over as Jack's car came to a halt on the far side of the circuit. However, he was able to push it home, exhausted, into 6th place. But points were only awarded to 5th place at the time. That result was encouraging, and Cooper were heading in the right direction. After places in other minor events, Cooper came to the British Grand Prix at Aintree. 2 cars were entered, for Brabham and Salvadori, and there was a private entry from Bob Gerrard. In the race, Brabham retired, and Gerrard's car wasn't competitive. By the end, Roy Salvadori, in spite of gearbox problems, was able to get his Cooper across the line in 5th place to take the first World Championship point for a rear-engined car in Grand Prix racing. It was a remarkable performance by the small company, although it was overshadowed at the time by Stirling Moss's breakthrough win for Van Wall. Cooper had started their giant killing act, and with it had become an important manufacturer of Grand Prix cars.
We started fitting the 1.5 litre Climax engine to start with, and then we realised that the potential of the twin cam 1.5, and we went to 1750, and then to 2 litres. And really, it was through Roy Salvadori and Jack Brabham, of course, and Rob Walker, that we decided to get. We eventually got a special crank made and went to 2.2, and that is the actual engine that Stirling won at the Argentine Grand Prix in, I think that was January 1958.
Moss didn't change tyres and was able to outlast the Ferraris. Salvadori and Brabham brought the Works Coopers to Monaco in 1958, and while Moss was engaged with Van Wall, the Rob Walker car was to be driven by Frenchman Maurice Trintignant. This was the circuit that the small cars had been designed for. They were easier on fuel and tyres and more nimble. In practice, the Coopers were extremely quick, with Brabham on the front row and Trintignant and Salvadori on the second. Salvadori shot into the lead, only to go off at the first corner in all the excitement. Salvadori's car in the pits for repairs. While BRM and Van Wall led the race in the early stages, the Works Coopers were in trouble. It was Maurice Trintignant, however, who provided the surprise. Having taken care of the car and its fragile transmission, Trintignant moved closer to the lead. The Rob Walker team and Coopers were ecstatic as once again a Cooper was leading a Grand Prix. Maurice Trintignant brought the Cooper to victory in the Monaco Grand Prix in 1958. The first 2 races of the year had been won by the new rear-engined Cooper. Salvadori went on to finish 4th in the Dutch Grand Prix and was running well in the Belgian when he had clutch problems. The British Grand Prix at Silverstone was one of the best races of the year. Peter Collins showed he was still a force, streaking into the lead at the start. Behind, Salvadori's Cooper, which had started alongside the Ferraris on the front row, hung on to 4th place. 4th soon became 3rd. While Collins and Hawthorne duelled out front, Moss retired the Van Wall. Salvadori was always at his best at Silverstone, and here gave a fine account of himself, fighting off a challenge from Stuart Lewis Evans Van Wall to finish in third place. The drive was all the more remarkable because Roy was being scalded by the hot water pipes running from the radiator and through the cockpit. He recovered to go to the Nürburgring 2 weeks later and finished second in the tragic German Grand Prix that claimed the life of Ferrari driver Peter Collins.
I drove very hard in the British Grand Prix, and I enjoyed that. Nürburgring, we lost Peter, but even apart from that, it was a very boring race because it's a 14-mile circuit. I was second simply because there were a couple of accidents and a lot of the cars fell out. But the Silverstone, the British Grand Prix, that was very interesting because that was a hard race all the way through.
It was when we realised that the car was capable of winning Grand Prix, really, in sort of 57, really, and 58. And thanks to Roy, I mean, he did show us the business side of motor racing and how, and to stop playing about and really get down to it and build something and win the World Championship. And that's what we did in 1959.
Was John Cooper sad to see the partnership break up at the end of the year?
Very sad, yes. It was one of those things. I mean, Roy was very closely tied to Aston Martin, as you know. He'd won Le Mans, and they had built a Grand Prix car, and he felt committed to go with them. And Jack Brabham and Bruce stayed with me with the Cooper.
Well, actually, I very nearly made a big mistake and went to drive for BRM, who was talking to me about driving around about that time. And luckily, Reg Tanner from Esso talked me out of that and said, don't be silly, you stay with Coopers. And he gave me a nice contract and everything, and that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I stayed with Coopers.
Well, the 59 car still had the Citroen gearbox as the base based with the Jack Knight innards. Jack Knight built the innards for us. And we did have a lot of gearbox trouble. We used to virtually change the gearbox every Grand Prix and keep our fingers crossed that it lasted the Grand Prix.
We had a lot of trouble with a rear engine car having a gearbox that was suitable. You couldn't buy a rear engine gearbox that was any good for the car that would take the horsepower and do the job. So I got sent off to Paris to the Ursa company over there and modified the patterns and everything of the Ursa Citroen gearbox and made 15 of these gearboxes, and we'd done about 3 seasons racing with those 15 gearboxes. Coventry Climax made the wonderful 2.5 litre 4-cylinder Grand Prix engine, and that really put Coopers on the right track. 1959 and 1960 we had a wonderful 2 seasons, winning the championship both years.
With Brabham, New Zealander Bruce McLaren and the American Maston Gregory driving the Coopers at Monaco, there were high hopes of another victory. At the start, all eyes were on Stirling Moss as he had changed his approach to racing. Since 1954, when he joined the Maserati team, Moss had driven for works teams. By 1959, only Ferrari of the old guard remained. Van Wall and Maserati had gone, and in their place, Cooper and Lotus were emerging. Now Moss was with Rob Walker's small team in 1959, driving a Cooper and taking on the factory teams.
I was taking this car that Alf and his crowd had done, and Rob Walker put the money out to do it, and to me, to go with such a small outfit, a little road show like that, and go out and try and beat the others was most rewarding. I mean, we didn't get much help. I mean, Cooper wouldn't sell us his gearbox, that sort of thing, and Lotus wouldn't sell us the most up-to-date car. We did get the Climax engines, so we had a few hurdles to cross, which was shown obviously by the use of the Carlotti gearbox, which could have been and should have been a great gearbox, but it wasn't made out of material that was good enough, and therefore it let us down. But having said that, it wasn't for want of trying. The only people who could make a gearbox as quickly as we had to was in Italy. And the only guy that we knew who could do it and did in fact make a stunning gearbox for the change and everything was Carlotti. Now, we didn't know what we knew later, otherwise we could have, I'm sure, found materials for him, but we didn't know.
The Cooper name became known to a wide audience when they built a hotted-up version of the B&C Mini. The aim was to add some spice to the popular small car. While it was never intended for competition use, the Flying Brick had success in circuit racing and rallying, and in the film, The Italian Job. Cooper didn't modify the cars at their factory. Rather, they were paid a royalty for each Mini Cooper sold. Between 1961 and 1969, 99,281 Mini Coopers were built. An even faster version, the Cooper S, was built between 1963 and 1971, and of these, 45,629 were made. Unlike Colin Chapman of Lotus, who wanted to create an automotive empire, Cooper opted to remain on a smaller scale. At Monaco, the works Coopers of Brabham, McLaren and Gregory were at the front of the field from the word go. Only Moss could have challenged them, but gearbox problems intervened, and Jack Brabham took his first Grand Prix win. At Zandvoort, BRM took their one and only win with a 2.5 litre car in the whole of its career. Brabham had to give best to BRM on this occasion and finished second to Joe Bonnier. While BRM saw themselves as a pure Grand Prix contender, Cooper and Lotus had important production racing car businesses. The 500 era had ended, and Cooper continued with F1, F2 and Formula Junior, which eventually became Formula 3. The writing was on the wall. Already, BRM were making plans to change to a rear-engine design in 1960, and everyone else would soon follow. In the French Grand Prix at Reims, on a circuit which was expected to favour Ferrari, the Coopers went well and Jack finished third. In the British Grand Prix at Aintree, Jack Brabham dominated the race, starting from pole. On this occasion, Moss drove the BRM for his family's British Racing Partnership, fighting it out with young Bruce McLaren for second. McLaren was an emerging talent, and he set the fastest lap. Moss takes the lime green BRM out of the pits. He was unable to catch Bruce McLaren before the flag. Jack Brabham won the race and led the World Championship. One hiccup was the German Grand Prix at Avus in Berlin. Maston Gregory, who always reckoned he was the fastest driver in the team, was battling with the Ferraris. However, all three Coopers retired. Gregory waves to the crowds as he walks back to the pits. Tony Brooks went on to win in the Ferrari. The next race on the calendar was the Portuguese Grand Prix. Cooper came back into their own again. It wasn't the works cars this time, but Stirling Moss. Jack Brabham was a front runner in the early stages, but for a driver who had few accidents in his career, this was to be one race that didn't go well. He got mixed up with a slower car, and the result was a terrifying accident. While Moss went on to win, Jack reflected on what had happened.
Yes, actually, I did have an accident which was probably the biggest one I did have in my whole career. I was very lucky that was. I didn't have very many accidents, luckily. But that particular one was in Oporto. And the Portuguese organisers wanted to have a Portuguese driver, and they got a sports car driver by the name of Crabel, and put him in a Grand Prix car which belonged to Centro Sud, and he was circulating around on the circuit, getting in everybody's way. And Stirling, Moss and I were changing the lead several times in that time, having a great old dice, and we come across Crabel for about the third time, I think, we were passing him. And Stirling Moss was leading at the time. He went past Crabel, and Crabel swung back behind Moss to follow him and didn't see me, and knocked me straight off the road. And I went across the straw bales and luckily hit a telegraph post, which really saved me because there was a big drop on the other side. And had I not hit that telegraph post, the accident would have been a lot more serious than it was. But the car ricocheted back onto the circuit and tipped me out before it hit the road. And I walked away with just a few abrasions.
Moss wins the Portuguese Grand Prix. Another victory for Cooper. The Italian Grand Prix at Monza, and Cooper was taking on Ferrari at their home ground. In a very short space of time, Cooper had become the team to beat and one of the big names in Grand Prix racing. The race turned out to be a tremendous fight between the Coopers and the Ferraris, and the 2.5-litre Coventry Climax engine lacked nothing compared to the Ferrari V6. It wasn't the best race for Brabham, but it was certainly a race that Moss thoroughly enjoyed, winning in the Rob Walker Cooper. The Walker team had developed their own Colotti gearbox, and this caused trouble. Moss explained just what it was about his driving style that caused these problems.
The point is, if you happen to go out in the race and you happen to be leading and then the thing breaks, you are known as a car breaker. But on the Cooper, now in hindsight I realise why, because the engine we had enormous torque, all the Climaxes did, and I would change gear at low revs. I would, instead of going up to 7,000 or 6.8 we were allowed, I would change gear at about 5.5, thinking, well, I'm saving the engine, which I was. But by changing at 5,005, of course, I'm putting all the bang through the gearbox. I technically didn't know sufficient to realise that. If I had known, if I'd been an engineer, I would have known that changing with maximum torque would put more through the gearbox than spinning it up. And I probably would have revved the engine up to 6.5 instead of 5.8 or whatever I did, and saved the gearbox and done better, but I didn't know that.
Fair enough, we did win the World Championship in '59 on the last race with Jack. Although Jack ran out of fuel and Bruce finished third, but Jack still managed to win the World Championship. But then we went to in fact, Bruce won that Sebring race, the American Grand Prix, and he was the youngest Grand Prix driver ever to win a race, a Grand Prix, and I think that still stands. He was 21. And in January we went to the Argentine Grand Prix, which was the first race of the 1960 season. We're still with the 59 cars, of course, and Bruce won that race as well. So he was then the youngest driver ever to lead the World Championship, which was rather nice. But at that race, Lotuses had produced a rear-engine car, their first rear-engine car. Innes Ireland was driving it. And it was very light. It was probably quite a bit lighter than ours, not as strong as our car, mind you. And it was very quick, and it worried Jack very much, and Bruce. But although Bruce did win the race because it broke, and on the way home in the aeroplane, we virtually said, we really redesign the whole motor car for 1960. And the gearbox was already being made because that had been a year on the drawing board, and the gearbox was nearly ready, the new gearbox, to replace the Citroen type gearbox. And we made a much lower car with a different suspension, a proper wishbone coil spring suspension on the back. and the driver laid back more in the car, and it handled a lot better, and I think the 60s car was a great car, really. In fact, I know Jack managed to have an accident at Monaco with the car, but he won the next 5 Grand Prix in a row, which wasn't bad.
The design team of John Cooper and Jack Brabham, and the testing abilities of Brabham and McLaren as drivers, were undoubtedly responsible for the number of races that Cooper won at this time. Although Lotus were on the way up, Stirling Moss's accident in Belgium saw him out of Grand Prix racing at a critical stage, and neither Surtees nor Jim Clark were able to cope with the Australian in full flight. Here at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, Brabham showed that the new low-line Cooper was very much the car to watch. There was a surprise in the performance of another driver. Graham Hill in the rear-engine BRM had started badly on the grid, but he came through the field to take and pass Brabham and lead the race, until this spin at Copse. He retired and Jack went on to victory. Jack Brabham won the 1960 World Championship with Bruce McLaren second, and Cooper won their second Manufacturers' Award. (1960) was the peak of Cooper's achievements in Grand Prix racing. A change of formula in 1961 was to set the British cars back, and Cooper's decline was swift. The team could only manage 4th place. Ferrari were better prepared and bounced back to win the championship. Coventry Climax was still developing its 1.5-litre V8 engines. It certainly didn't suit the reigning world champion, as Jack explains.
Well, in 1961, unfortunately, they changed the formula on us, and we were all set up going very well on the 2.5-litre formula. But when it went to 1.5 litre, we were on a back foot really, because the 1.5 litre engine to start with gave a lot of trouble, and it was just unreliable compared with the 2.5 litre one. But having said that, it was just a bad year for us really.
At the end of 1960, Brabham took the 2.5-litre Grand Prix car to Indianapolis for some tests. Cooper built a special car, and Coventry Climax built a slightly larger engine. Jack went to Indianapolis in 1961, finished 9th, and took the rear-engined idea to America. Cooper didn't return to Indy, and it was the ambitious Colin Chapman of Lotus who took the next step, and Jack moved on to set up his own company.
Actually, 1961 really was the last year I had with Coopers, and at that time I was very keen to have either moved in and joined Coopers or go off and do our own thing. And the decision was made to go and build our own car, which we started in 1962. Well, I think I just finished up an ambition really, because I'd driven for Coopers and I'd had very successful time with them, and I always felt that I'd like to move on and build my own car, because the first car I ever drove in Australia was one I built myself anyway, so it was really going back to what I'd originally done. And I had a very good friend in Australia by the name of Ron Toranak, who as you know today is one of the best designers in this country. And I brought him over to Australia and we joined forces together, and we finished up with a very good team, and we've done very well.
Was John Cooper sorry to lose Jack?
Oh, I'd love to have kept, yeah, of course I was, but that's motor racing, isn't it, really? It's, he wanted, I think in his own heart, he wanted to go and build his own car, which was fair enough, and I had great respect for him, and crikey, he won the World Championship twice with it, didn't he, straight away.
Cooper still had success, firstly with Bruce McLaren at Monaco in 1962.
Yes, we won Monaco and we won the Reims, actually, with Bruce and that. But by that time, a lot of people had caught up with us with the rear engine formula, and the Ferrari's engines were giving so much more power as well, the 1.5 litres, which made it more difficult.
Charles Cooper was an extremely conservative man when it came to design and the running of his company. He might take notice of Salvadori and he might listen to Jack Brabham, but when it came to Bruce McLaren, he was less inclined to do so. And slowly but surely, Colin Chapman's designs overtook Cooper. They faced competition from Lotus, Lola and Brabham in the production racing car business. Charles Cooper passed away, John Cooper was injured in a road accident, and the team lost momentum. There are very few recordings of Bruce McLaren. This is how he came to leave Cooper and start his own company.
I haven't actually raced my own car over here in Europe for quite a few years, since in fact 1958. But I have been racing cars out in New Zealand and Australia, and built up a little bit of a team to race there in January and February each year. But this year we decided, as well as racing in New Zealand and Australia, we'd start out in Europe. We tried to analyse it as best we could. We decided that the car that would probably win would be a lightweight car powered by a relatively big American engine. And this is what we've endeavoured to do in building our Cooper Oldsmobile. We're going to use that, and have used it, as a sort of test vehicle, a test mule in effect, trying out various components. We'll now aim at trying to build a very good car based on that one. Actually, personally, I'm hoping that this big sports car racing will catch on. It's quite spectacular to watch, and it's a lot cheaper than Formula One. The engines aren't this £5,000 and £6,000 touch. Yeah, I think if anything, the big sports cars are more fun to watch than the Formula One cars. Next year, I think this might be a very popular form of racing.
The big sports cars did become popular, and Bruce had massive success in the Can-Am series. Where would Cooper go now? John Cooper tells the story from 1966.
Well, that's really, I'd lost my father at that time, and they changed the formula to 3 litres, which was going to become very expensive because they were talking about 16-cylinder engines and 4-wheel drive motor cars. And I was introduced through Roy, to Jonathan Seath of the M&S fame, and I think the idea at that time was to run a St Michael Grand Prix team, and also Jonathan had the import concession for the Maserati engine. That's how we came to build the Cooper Maserati.
The other big change was that Roy Salvadori came back as team manager.
I'd started the season with a contract to race a Cobra Shelby sports car, and we cut that short because I had, as I say, the opportunity of team managing for John Cooper.
Cooper developed a full monocoque for the 1966 3-litre season. Their competition? Jack Brabham and the Repco engine, which was to go on to win the World Championship. From the start, it was apparent that Austrian Jochen Rindt was going to be a front-runner in Grand Prix racing, if the car could cope with his forceful driving style. In the early races of the season, he was supported by Richie Ginther, on loan from Honda.
Yes, we had an old frame that we put the original 3-litre Maserati engine in. We did our test work on that, and I think that Jochen was in Austria, didn't come over for the testing, so I was landed with the major part of the testing. Well, we had a very good car and we had a very good season. We had a problem with tyres. We were on Dunlop tyres, and what we didn't know at the time, we were getting problems going through races, and it was the tyre wouldn't go through any oily conditions when there was oil on the circuit, and we'd drop our own fair share with Maserati. The performance of the car seemed to go off, and it wasn't until the end of the season that we discovered it was the Dunlop tyre. We then changed to Firestone, and we were much more competitive, but we'd lost the first part of the season.
On a damp track at Brands Hatch for the British Grand Prix, the Coopers were certainly competitive, but unable to challenge Jack Brabham and Denny Hulme. (1964) world champion John Surtees joined Cooper in 1966 after falling out with Ferrari.
Yes, John had learned an awful lot. Don't forget he had a very short career as a racing car driver. His great experience was with motorcycles, so he had a very short span. He was in at the deep end. He went virtually straight into Formula One, which is very unusual.
Jochen Rindt was a determined character, as Roy Salvadori remembers. They were supposed to be constantly at odds, and there were times when tempers flared, but it wasn't that often.
No. He used to fly off the handle, so did I, but that was all. It would all sort of hang itself together, and he would do his job and I would do mine. He felt he wasn't getting the right car. He felt he wasn't getting the right deal, but that was Jochen. After that, he'd get in the car and drive like hell. And he was a super driver, very hard on the car, but a potential world champion. I have to say this, that I never thought he would make it. I thought he was so hard on the car that when he joined Lotus, I thought, well, now we'll find out, he's going to break the car continuously. And I was so wrong. Something happened to Jochen, and he got the message, and he was winning races in a Lotus car. And anybody that does that's got to be pretty gentle with machinery.
John Surtees left at the end of 1966 to take up his Honda contract. He was replaced by Pedro Rodriguez, who drove alongside Rindt in 1967. The Cooper Maserati presented difficulties all of its own. The Maserati engine was a development of their V12 250F from the 1950s.
And that car did win a couple of Grand Prix. Surtees and Rodriguez won the Mexican and the South African. They were our last two Grand Prix that we won.
1967 was Cooper's last full season in Grand Prix racing, and they did score 2 wins, despite the old engine being unreliable and underpowered. Rindt was anxious to move on unless Cooper could provide him with a different power unit for 1968. Salvadori was also unhappy. There had been a change in the company structure at the team's new owners, the Chipstead Motor Group, and this meant there was no opportunity to buy the new Ford DFV engine. Rindt, meanwhile, moved on to Brabham for 1968, and then on to Colin Chapman's Lotus team in 1969. Sadly, his World Championship in 1970 was a posthumous one.
Yeah, it'll start.
At the end of 1967, things had to change, and the question was, which engine should they use?
Well, yes, I mean, it's always much more difficult dealing with with Climaxes, we were dealing with a firm that was just up the road, and it was much easier, and we found it much more difficult dealing with somebody in Italy. I know today it's easy, they deal with people in Japan, and it works, but we found it much more difficult. To us it was a long way off, and it wasn't a bad car, and it was the start of the 3-litre type motor cars,
Cooper chose BRM engines. Roy Salvadori left the team, leaving John to run it alone in 1968.
Well, I thought we'd stand very much more chance with the Ford engine. Most certainly I didn't have any faith in the BRM project, and basically I was right about that. Things were changing at Cooper's, and I had an opportunity to buy Thomson & Taylor, and which was a grand old garage that built most of the pre-war British racing cars, and I thought that was too good an opportunity to miss, so I bought Thomson & Taylor and left Cooper's.
Cooper, the team that led a major change in Grand Prix racing, finally said goodbye to it all in 1968. And John retired happy with the team's achievements.
Well, I love Grand Prix racing. I love everything that happens to it. But looking back, I had marvellous times, really, in those years, and had some great friends, Salvadorian, Jack and Bruce. It was great, really. And I probably came out of it at the right time.
After the Grand Prix racing was over, John Cooper settled back to running the family car garage in West Sussex. However, the Cooper name was always remembered by Mini enthusiasts, especially in Japan. When the new Mini was released, the Cooper name was revived for the sporting version. And the success of this car has brought a new generation of drivers to appreciate the Cooper name. John Cooper was able to see the new car before he died in January 2000. The importance of Cooper is immense, as an integral part of creating the British racing car industry, as a Grand Prix pioneer, and as world champions.